Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the first module of week 1. Today we're exploring the neurobiology of trauma, how traumatic experiences literally change the brain and shape our behavior patterns. Many of us have grown up believing that our struggles with addiction are moral failings or signs of weakness. Today I want to reframe that understanding through the lens of neuroscience and help you see that what you're experiencing is your brain and body's natural response to overwhelming experiences. When we experience something traumatic, our brain's alarm system, the amygdala, activates instantly. This almond-shaped structure deep within our limbic system doesn't think, it reacts. It triggers our survival response: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, the rational, thinking part of our brain, responsible for planning, reasoning, and self-regulation, becomes temporarily suppressed. As Dr. Bruce Perry explains in his famous book, What Happened to You, the lower parts of the brain don't want the analyzing, planning, considering part of the brain slowing things down when there's an emergency. And this is crucial for survival. Imagine if our executive brain kicked in first if approached by an angry pit bull, for example. Our executive or logical brain would respond with, "I wonder whose dog this is. I wonder if he wants to bite me." No, our fight, flight, freeze, or fawn kicks in first to help us survive by fighting or fleeing. Unless, of course, you freeze or fawn, then let's hope, inshallah, that it doesn't want to bite you. This means that during traumatic experiences, we aren't fully processing what's happening to us in a coherent, narrative way. Instead, fragments of sensory information, sounds, smells, bodily sensations, images get stored in our implicit memory systems without the contextual framework that normally accompanies memories. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk captures this beautifully in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, when he writes, "Trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by the experience on the mind, brain, and body." So, for example, if you did get attacked by the pit bull, may Allah protect us from that, the experience will forever be imprinted on the mind, where your fight or flight may kick in anytime you hear a dog collar jingle. When trauma occurs, especially during childhood or when it's repeated, it doesn't just affect us temporarily, it actually rewires our brain. The stress hormones released during traumatic events, cortisol and adrenaline, are designed for short-term emergencies. But when we experience chronic trauma or lack safety after a traumatic event, these stress chemicals continue to flood our system, leading to long-term changes in brain structure and function. There are 3 key areas of the brain that are particularly impacted. The first is the hippocampus. This is a seahorse-shaped structure which is crucial for memory formation and contextualizing experiences. Chronic stress causes the hippocampus to physically shrink, making it harder to distinguish between past and present threats. This is why trauma survivors often experience flashbacks. The past feels like it's happening right now. Next is the prefrontal cortex, which is my favorite part of the brain, and we referred to earlier as the executive brain. Trauma impairs the development and functioning of our rational brain, particularly affecting our ability to regulate emotions, make decisions, and exercise good judgment. When this area is compromised, we have trouble calming down after becoming upset. And third is the amygdala, which I also mentioned as our brain's alarm system. This becomes hyperactive after trauma, constantly scanning for danger. It becomes physically larger and more sensitive, making us jumpy, easily triggered, and prone to perceiving threats even in safe situations. As van der Kolk notes, traumatized people chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies. The past is alive in the form of a gnawing interior discomfort. And to note, this interior discomfort almost always goes undetected because we've lived with it for so long, it's become our norm. And even if we're able to detect it, we're unable to articulate the source and usually write it off as boredom, ADHD, anxiety, and in some cases, autism. There's a lot of overlap in symptoms with trauma and these other diagnoses. More on that later, inshallah. To understand trauma fully, we need to look beyond the brain to the entire nervous system. Our autonomic nervous system has 2 main branches that regulate our state of arousal. The sympathetic nervous system, or SNS, activates our gas pedal, increasing heart rate, breathing, and energy when we need to respond to a threat. The parasympathetic nervous system, or PNS, is our brake, slowing things down and returning us to a state of calm and safety. Trauma disrupts this delicate balance. Many trauma survivors get stuck in sympathetic activation, constantly on high alert. Others may default to the parasympathetic freeze response, becoming numb, disconnected, and shut down. In the words of the Quran, "Verily with hardship comes ease." This is one of my favorite quotes from the Quran, but unfortunately, for those with unhealed trauma, finding ease becomes incredibly difficult because the nervous system itself has been altered by overwhelming experiences. And this is where addiction enters the picture. When our nervous system is dysregulated and our brain is flooded with unbearable sensations, feelings, and memories, we instinctively seek relief. Substances and addictive behaviors temporarily regulate our dysregulated nervous system. They can numb overwhelming feelings, create a brief sense of connection when we feel isolated, or provide stimulation when we feel dead inside. As Dr. Gabor Mate often says, the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. Research shows that adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, dramatically increases the risk of addiction later in life. This isn't a coincidence, it's neurobiology. When early trauma impairs our brain's natural regulation systems, we become vulnerable to finding external solutions for internal dysregulation. In the book, What Happened to You, Dr. Perry explains, your brain is use dependent, which means it grows through being used. Much as exercising a muscle increases its size and makes it stronger, the more a neural system is activated, the stronger it becomes. This means that if we repeatedly turn to substances or behaviors to regulate our emotions, these neural pathways become strengthened and the addiction takes hold, not because we lack willpower, but because our brains have adapted to trauma in the most efficient way it knows how. One critical aspect of trauma neurobiology is dissociation, the mind's ability to disconnect from overwhelming experiences. Dissociation exists on a spectrum from mild detachment to complete fragmentation of awareness. During trauma, especially childhood trauma, dissociation is protective. It allows us to mentally escape when physical escape is impossible. But over time, this survival mechanism becomes maladaptive. Many addictive behaviors serve the same function as dissociation. They help us escape overwhelming internal states. The substance or behavior becomes a chemical dissociation that allows temporary relief from intolerable feelings. As van der Kolk states, traumatized people are often afraid of feeling. It's not so much the perpetrators, who hopefully are no longer around to hurt them, but their own physical sensations that are now the enemy. Trauma also profoundly affects how memories are stored and processed. Normal memories have a beginning, middle, and end. They're integrated into our life story and change slowly over time. Traumatic memories, however, are different. They're stored as fragmented sensory impressions without the contextual information that would place them firmly in the past. They intrude into the present as flashbacks, nightmares, and bodily sensations that feel immediate and dangerous. This helps explain why many people with addiction issues report certain triggers. A sound, smell, anniversary date, the sound of someone's voice, or physical sensation can suddenly create an overwhelming craving or emotional distress that seems to come out of nowhere. These triggers are actually activating fragmented trauma memories stored in the body and the brain. The addiction then becomes a way to cope with this sudden activation of the trauma response. Another crucial concept in understanding trauma neurobiology is the window of tolerance, a term coined by Dr. Dan Siegel. This describes the optimal zone of arousal where we can think clearly, feel our emotions without being overwhelmed, and engage effectively with others. Trauma narrows this window, making it easier to slip into either hyperarousal, anxiety, panic, and anger, or hypoarousal, numbness, dissociation, disconnection, depression. When we're outside of this window of tolerance, our prefrontal cortex, the executive and rational brain, goes offline, and we're driven by more primitive brain regions, making thoughtful choices nearly impossible. For many with trauma histories, the window of tolerance is so narrow that everyday stressors regularly push them outside of it. Addiction often represents an attempt to artificially widen this window or to dampen the distress of being outside of it. The Prophet, peace be upon him, touched on this concept of balance regulation when he said, "The strong person is not the one who overcomes people, but the one who overcomes his anger." This speaks to the importance of emotional regulation, a capacity often severely compromised in those with trauma. Despite these profound changes, there's tremendous hope in the science of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. SubhanAllah. As van der Kolk explains, we now know that the brain is neither immutable nor static, but continuously remodeled by experiences. This means that with the right conditions and experiences, we can literally rewire the trauma patterns in our brain. The same neuroplasticity that allowed our brains to adapt to trauma can now be harnessed for healing. Throughout this course, we'll explore practices that leverage neuroplasticity, the reshaping of the brain, to create new, healthier neural pathways. from mindfulness and prayer to regulate the nervous system, to therapeutic approaches that help process traumatic memories, to the meaningful connections that provide the safety needed for the brain to change. Understanding the neurobiology of trauma allows us to move from shame and self-blame to compassionate self-understanding. Your addictive patterns aren't character flaws. They're adaptations your brain made to survive overwhelming experiences. Recovery, then, isn't about forcing yourself to just stop using these adaptations. It's about healing the underlying trauma that drives them and creating new neural pathways that serve your well-being. As we move forward in this course, remember that your brain has been doing exactly what Allah created it to do: protect you from perceived threats and intolerable feelings. With knowledge, compassion, and the right support, you can help your brain and nervous system learn new patterns. The journey of healing involves honoring these adaptations for how they've helped you survive, while gently creating newer, healthier ways of meeting your needs for safety, connection, and regulation. In our next module, Understanding Addiction as Adaptation, we'll build directly on what you've learned today. We'll explore more deeply how addiction serves as a coping response to underlying pain rather than a character flaw. You'll gain a framework for understanding your own addictive patterns as adaptive responses that made sense given what happened to you. Remember, in the words of the Quran, Allah does not burden a soul beyond that it can bear. With each step you take in understanding your neurobiology, you're developing the capacity to bear what once felt unbearable. Not alone, but with knowledge, community, and compassion. May Allah reward you for being curious, and I'll see you in the next module, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.